I like the way people have positioned themselves in this room. Some of the back, some in front, a lot of chairs in between. I hope they fill up. A very good evening to all of you. On behalf of the Center for Contemporary Studies of the Indian Institute of Science, it's a great pleasure for me to welcome Mr. C.V. Ranganathan. Mr. C.V. Ranganathan is a distinguished member of the 1959 batch of the Indian Foreign Service. He has had an illustrious career in the Indian Foreign Service and served in several important positions in our missions abroad. I tried to compress where all he had been. I think it would have ended up me speaking and him listening, so I just compressed it to quite a bit here. He is a well-known China expert. Ambassador Srinivasan has had 2 stints in China. His first as the first secretary of the Indian Embassy in China in between 1965 and 68 coincided with a period of intense hostility to India, which included attacks on our diplomats by the Red Guards. I mean, he was a witness to that. Mr. Ranganathan returned to China as our ambassador between 1987 and 1991 at another exciting period of its history, sometime after Deng Xiaoping had returned to favor and begun the kind of reforms that have spectacularly transformed that country. Mr. Ranganathan passed out with a distinction in Chinese studies from the Hong Kong University and continues to be fluent in Mandarin. Mr. Ranganathan is one of our country's top China experts with a deep understanding of that country. He was the convener of the National Security Advisory Board and currently is co-chairman of the India-China Eminent Persons Group, and he has been so since 2006. We of the Center for Contemporary Studies of the Indian Institute of Science are very happy to have him here today, and thank you for coming. And in this talk, which is jointly hosted with the Ministry of External Affairs under its public policy initiative, he'll be speaking to us today on A Prosperous China Faces Problems at Home and Contradictions Abroad. Over to you, Mr. Ranganathan.
Thank you, Dr. Balakrishnan. And I thank the Ministry of External Affairs for plucking me out of a very contented retirement and the Center for Contemporary Studies of the Indian Institute of Science for inviting me here today. I'd just like to demur a little with these words. With great civilization countries like India and China, nobody is an authority. All you have is small glimpses of these very complex societies. But China has been my interest, as kindly indicated by Dr. Balakrishnan. I have known it in very bad times, the times of the last years of Mao Zedong, where he inflicted the great proletarian cultural revolution on the Chinese public. And then, of course, it was my good fortune also to have been posted in Hong Kong, where I was Commissioner of India, at a time when China was opening up. In fact, most of you would have heard of the special economic zones. These were abutting Hong Kong, and I went to one of the inaugurations of one of them. But by then, China was reforming. Now, I have family associations with the Indian Institute of Science, and I'm so grateful to meet Dr. Gupta, thanks to Dr. Anand, both of whom knew my elder brother, Dr. C.V. Seshadri, late Dr. C.V. Seshadri. In those days, he was one of the few who decided to return to India after his doctorate in what used to be the Institute of Chemical Engineering, but now called Carnegie Mellon, I think, in Pittsburgh. And he was a scholar on a little pittance of 400 rupees, a CSIR fellow. And he spent his time, for the time that the fellowship lasted, before he got inducted into the Institute of Technology in Kanpur, and he was here for some years. But his son, Dr. Ram Seshadri, who did chemistry honors in St. Stephen's, Delhi, came here and did a doctorate in chemistry. He has followed the reverse direction of migrating out, and he is now in the University of California in Santa Barbara. He was, I think, at least reportedly, Dr. C.N.R. Rao's favorite student. Many of you must have been to China, at least you would have, I'm sure, from whatever appears in the public domain, would have seen with those who go there come back with absolutely awestruck with the phenomenal development. In fact, there are very few countries in the world in contemporary history where such a vast population has reached prosperity levels in so short a time. I think this makes every visitor to China awestruck. But the other side of China, which is going to be half of my talk today, is the problems that this philosophy of growth at any cost, underlying also or backed by political stability at any cost under the monoparty regime, were the principal features of a China which was on its road to prosperity. But this prosperity came at the cost of a lot of unhappiness and social discontent. And for a person like me who's watched China for so many years, I was quite pleasantly surprised at the last party conclave that they had in 2012, November, which elected the new government led by Xi Jinping, who is the president who holds multiple offices. I'll come to that later. But what struck me about this particular party conference, which was held in November 2012, was extremely frank and frankly quite uncharacteristic of the Chinese, who love to praise themselves, as we do in India too. But this party congress tackled very, very boldly the enormous problems faced by China. I talked about an unhappy China. And so they were very frank about acknowledging the series of problems that China was faced with. Of course, part of the problems were also caused by the international environment, where a very benign USA was encouraging China to develop the manufacturing export-led growth model, which incidentally was also the model of many East Asian countries, South Korea, Japan, many Southeast Asian countries. And so for years and years, the Americans spent, the Chinese supplied, and the Chinese became very export dependent. But this model collapsed after the US financial collapse, followed by later in West Europe. So what followed was a realization in China that that particular growth model which they had followed over the years was unsustainable, and the very resounding manner in which they acknowledged this. Now, amongst other problems that this unsustainable model of growth brought to China was the enormous urban-rural divide and the inequity in access to several things which were guaranteed actually even in the pre-reform days. The reform started roughly in 1978 under, as you mentioned, Deng Xiaoping. But the fact is that access to basics like education, healthcare, etc., was available only to the affluent and not to those who were left out of this prosperity wave. And the people who were left out were largely in the rural areas and not in the coastal areas which were privileged. But apart from these inequities, it was also clear that the sort of pollution, particularly the air quality, the water quality, plus in the get-rich-quick mentality, the tendency of Chinese industries to contaminate products like milk, like baby feed, like other processed foods was enormous, and so on. But the biggest single problem that the party faced while achieving all this prosperity was the rampant corruption that party cadres indulged in. And this, I suppose, can be explained by human nature, where you have a vastly bloated party of more than 80 millions. Obviously, the tendency is to see how soon they could also profit from the prevailing ethos. And particularly in the rural areas, there was the most enormous expropriation, very arbitrary decisions, particularly where land and resources were concerned, and therefore you had the phenomenon of enormous corruption. And I have not heard such a resounding criticism of corruption in India as I read in the party documents after the 12th Party Congress. There is a sentence there that says that corruption will not only finish the Communist Party of China, and mind you, it is a monoparty government and continues to be, has been, but not only that, it will also disintegrate China as a country. This was their public acknowledgement of the scale and quality of corruption. Now, in addition to these problems, is another problem which, of course, in my opinion, is entirely self-inflicted, namely the alienation of the ethnic minorities in China, whether it is Xinjiang, whether it is Xizang or Tibet. And Tibet or Tibetans are not just confined to what we know as Tibet here, but also to other provinces, abutting provinces of Tibet, Yunnan, Sichuan, Qinghai, and 3 or 4 provinces. So Tibetans are spread all over, and so it's not just Xinjiang, but Tibet and also Inner Mongolia. Here, the problem appears to be that just waving the magic wand of prosperity and economic growth and development have not removed the basic urge towards seeking greater respect and non-interference in their religious beliefs, in their ways of life, and in, again, the equal access of opportunities also to benefit from this growth. Because the growth has been monopolized by immigrants of the majority ethnic Han race, and this is the case whether it's in Xinjiang or in Tibet. And in the case of Xinjiang, one can argue that the opposition is even more virulent. It is even more virulent because Xinjiang has a line to the international upsurge of political Islam in other parts of the world. Tibet, of course, may be more insulated. However, Tibet has the very inspirational figure of Dalai Lama, and naturally, allegiance by the believing Tibetan is more in the Dalai Lama than in the state. Then, of course, and there could be quite a few economists here in this distinguished group, there has been a stagnant model of economic growth, which was completely concentrated on the dominance of the public sector units in China. They had privileged access to bank lending, they had access to the market, the monopoly, and so on. So, you had these sort of problems, and in order to for the private sector to survive, they resorted to shadow banking, in other words, informal banking channels. And the problem with official banks, of which there are 4, is that they offered very low rates of interest. And unlike Indian banks, even those that are nationalized, there have been very few offers or very few portfolio of bankable investments which will give far more returns on one's savings. Of course, with all that, one has to admire the Chinese for their extremely high rate of savings. So, you had this dominance, or rather growth, of a shadow banking structure where informal loans were given from those, and this has been utilized for real estate development, feeding into again the sort of corruption that I spoke about of party cadres, particularly not just in urban areas but also in rural areas. Then you have a variety of social problems, not just the ones that I talked about, but also novel socio-psychological problems caused by the one-child policy. This has led to a skewed demographic profile where there are far more males than there are females. And in fact, right now I am reading a very interesting novel in Chinese. It's called The Difficult Years, and it's about the fate of bachelors in China. And those of you who are bachelors, I congratulate you for being in India, because what this novel works in great detail, in a very amusing detail, is that girls have become very rapacious. They want to marry only, sorry ma'am, are you the only lady here? Oh no, you're there. They want to marry only those who have plush jobs, who have an apartment of their own, who refuse to, who say that after marriage they will not stay with their elderly parents. And of course, car, I said, again, what model car is important, and an apartment, and so on. So they say the price of marriage is intolerable and very difficult to give. And as you know, the one-child policy has led to other psychological disturbances. They call little princelings, in fact they are called little tyrants, who demand and are spoilt by their parents and the rest of it. And there has been the most enormous scale of female feticide. So this is a psychological problem. And therefore, what all this did lead to is quite a lot of mobilization on the part not just of urban dwellers but also of rural things, who were highly discontented by what they saw as an inequitable distribution of the wealth, and of course the predatory nature of the Communist Party of China. And you've had mobilization centering around causes and NGOs, from environment to environment again is such a broad subject, to rule of law, to violation of the Constitution, and so on and so forth. And quite a few of them have led to vast numbers of people protesting, even riots. These are, of course, more common in Xinjiang, which I talked about, and of course, the question of self-immolations in Tibet, which is now numbered more than 100, and so on. And these in turn led to vigorous police action and, of course, action against those activists who were identified. So you had these sort of problems, and one could go on, of course, a lot more about many of the problems of China, but I think I've said enough to indicate what I said earlier, namely a prosperous China, but also not a happy China. And then when you get down to the new leadership, which was formed after this party congress which I talked about, Xi Jinping as president, Li Keqiang as premier, these are the two principal people. The first thing that Xi Jinping did was to straight away take a very populist stand. And he said that I agree with all of you that you've had no access to better education. All of you have very common aspirations like better education for your children, better health facilities, better air quality, better food, and so on and so forth. And then he urged the people to share what he called the Chinese dream. And this Chinese dream, according to Xi Jinping, which has not been elaborated in much greater detail, is that of rejuvenation of the great China. Now mark these words rather carefully. These in turn appeal to several things which are intrinsic to Chinese culture. A great past history, 100 years or more of humiliation largely inflicted by Western countries. The most enormous cruelty is experienced at the hands of Japan. The bitter civil war between Mao Zedong led Communist Party and the KMT, which then fled to Taiwan. And of course, the years of recovery, economic recovery after reform. He is appealing to a variety of these things, appealing to, I would say, the extremist views of nationalism in China, examples of which you found in the reactions to the unfortunate Malaysian air crash, and so on. But the idea of appealing to an objective like this, abstract though it may be, is to also, in my opinion, underline an objective which is non-ideological. And the Chinese are a very ideological people, the basis being the dominance of the party. Open doors wide, but remember, or rather, reconcile to the fact that this will be a one-party state. And recently you might have even read in the papers how Xi Jinping, in sitting in Belgium, completely disavows the applicability of the model of multi-party democracy based on a parliamentary system of government. In other words, the Chinese say that the Communist Party of China is the best guardian of the interests of the Chinese people, and its dominance cannot be challenged. And what, on the one hand, while talking of the rule of law rather than the rule by men, the fact remains that that system today and for the foreseeable future will not countenance a separation of powers between the legislature, executive, and the judiciary. The judiciary is a tool of the executive. Having talked enough about the problems in the broader political shall I say, framework in which China is governed, what were the new policy proposals suggested to get out of all the problems that I talked about. The emphasis today, or rather at least from 2012, has turned solidly to social governance rather than emphasis purely on the economic part. One example of this social governance is how the Chinese intend to deal with the millions of the migrant workers who are allowed to migrate to the urban areas as the basic low paid worker living in the most abominable conditions and building all those skyscrapers that you see in China, in whichever town you go to. They were really sweated labor. And what makes things so sad for the migrant workers is that in the old China, it is changing now, again changing very gradually, is that in China you were registered in the place where you were born. And it is only in the place you were born that you have access, and your children too, to things like education, healthcare, etc. So the migrant worker had to live on very low wages, stuffed in dormitories, and this is going to change in the abolition of this hukou or registration system, which is endemic to China in all these years. Now let us see how that works. The second thing is the emphasis now on increasing domestic consumption in lieu of the enormous reliance on exports alone. This in turn will involve raising the salary levels, particularly of those in rural areas. And obviously, consumption would also involve innovation, and enormous amounts are being promised to be invested in anything that goes to innovation, including higher education and equivalence of institutes of excellence such as this in China. Then a readjustment of the dominant role of the public sector's projects to make them a public sector owned huge industries, to make them far more competitive, to make them more responsive to the requirements of the market, and to lead and to cut down their monopoly role, which of course involves an expanded role of the markets, of course under strict government regulations, but also of reform of the fiscal system, where there will be more equal opportunities for the private sector to access loans and other things. But on the political side, and it has been rather like a hothouse with occasions to protest, of course, but being put down. But in the political side, to expand the institutions for greater democratic consultations with the public in every area, so that the public are informed about projects that come up, and the public are able to give their views, not just on projects, but also on other welfare benefits in localities. And of course, a vigorous crackdown on party corruption, and Xi Jinping is reported to have said that nobody will be spared, even the tigers and the flies, meaning high and low, and you do see evidence of this. But then this is all just scratching the surface. Corruption really is far more endemic. And of course, to continue to do what the Chinese are best at, namely increase investments in infrastructure, which means more roads, more high-speed railways, more power plants, although what the energy base would be, because they need to avoid burning coal in the interests of having a cleaner air. And of course, enormous investments also in nuclear power production. And it has to be admitted that Chinese investment in environmental measures has also been very impressive. And this is where I think they continue, Western companies who are involved in producing pollution control material in things like thermal power plants and others are doing extremely good business in China. And more importantly, in order to boost more consumption, a variety of social security measures in the rural areas, including the right to be able to alienate land. In other words, obviously the rural peasant was not at all getting a fair price for alienating his land for all the projects that came up, but that is to stop. They now talk of market pricing applying to the alienation of land. And mind you, how they'll work it out is still a mystery to me, because in China, ownership of land is never private. You can own a house, you can run an industry, but you cannot own rural cultivable agricultural land. But what the farmer had is long leases, and how the lease system can be converted into market share in whatever land is sold is still to be worked out. And above all, I think China is today reconciled to having a much lower rate of GDP growth per annum. The rate at which they are reconciled will still be the envy of most countries, particularly the more advanced ones. It's 7.5 to 8. So if you have a total economy valued at something like $9 trillion, even if you grow at 7.5 to 8% a year, it is not inconsiderable. It is huge. So, as I said, it's a very frank recognition of problems. Approaching to solving these have been outlined, and I do not share the cynicism of most Western commentators on China, particularly the Weekly Economist, Financial Times, and quite a few others, who, because of the problems that China has today, including its fiscal problems, it's a highly indebted nation, domestically indebted nation, are forecasting a hard landing. And at least for the last 25 years, I've heard this expression hard landing, I've seen this expression hard landing in The Economist. I cannot see that happening. I think they're ingenious enough and have the mobilization and the organization to avoid this. And they have a good basis on which to restructure, although the task is gigantic, of a model which will now lead to modest growth, but a greater and more acceptable measure of social governance, which after all is absolutely necessary for the credibility of a mono-party government. And now I come to the contradictions abroad. Simultaneously with all this reformed structure and other things, there is an increase in the defense budget of China by 12%, as announced in the National People's Congress, the Chinese Parliament, which took place in March, where the annual report was presented by the Premier Li Keqiang. And this 12% is earmarked to increase the present budget. I think the total amounts to some 30 odd billions in US dollar terms. I may be wrong on the figure. But look at the justification for this increase, which should really be very carefully noted by China's neighbors. China needs to increase the budget, according to him, because we need to counter a high risk security environment in the region. And looking at the region, I can't see any risk except for the counter actions that China's neighbors have been forced to take. I can come to that either now or in question hour. Secondly, and in quote, place war preparations on a regular footing, whatever that means. Thirdly, undertake coordinated planning in military scenarios in all coordinated planning in military for the military actions in all scenarios. Push the development of new technology, weapons and equipment, and enhance border, coastal and air defenses. In the same speech, and this is where the Chinese don't see any contradictions, he also adds, inverted commas, China would advance neighborhood diplomacy, speed up infrastructure links with neighbors, and in this connection, he makes references to such links in our part of the world, in the Bangladesh, China, Indian, Myanmar region, which is seen as an economic corridor which is worthwhile pursuing by both governments as agreed to by all four governments, including of course the government of India. A maritime Silk Road linking Asia, the Indian and Pacific Oceans, and a corridor linking China and Pakistan. These are all extracts from his speech in the National People's Congress. Now, pari passu with the prosperity of China, the Chinese have used their very wide geographical area to change geopolitical circumstances. This is particularly true of Central Asia. During my time as ambassador in China, I once visited a Chinese port in Shandong province in the west of China. And there, at a railway siding, I was taken there specially for them to see, and they wanted me to report this to India and say, see what we can do in the future if we join. There was a fully loaded train with bananas from Philippines, cars from South Korea, other containers who I didn't know what it contained, leaving this port in the Pacific Ocean, destined to go to Rotterdam within 6 days. And the route is right through mainland China to Xinjiang, then to Kazakhstan, and to tie up with the huge railway system that the former Soviets had built far to the west of the Trans-Siberian. That is the scale of their geographic ambitions, and I'm now talking of several years ago. And now they've built roads which will one day, I mean, Laos, Cambodia, to Thailand. They are talking of other roads where they are inviting India very cordially, and I talked of the Bangladesh, China, India, Myanmar area to cooperate in building roads through Myanmar so that our eastern states can be linked up to Southeast Asia through this region. It's a project which years after my retirement I worked on for long years, but at last I am very gratified that it has become an intergovernmental project now. So let's see what happens. The Chinese see no contradictions in postures that call for higher defense preparedness and the announced policies towards neighbors. And the dilemmas for the neighbors, given China's rather expansive view of what constitutes Chinese sovereignty over maritime and territorial areas, should be a cause of concern. And these expanded claims, whether it's to South China Sea or to the Diaoyu, Senkaku Islands abutting, involving Japan, or of course our territorial disputes, are identified as the core interests of China which cannot be compromised. How long can I go for?
Another 15 minutes, as long as you want actually, but up to 5.
No, up to 5.
Yeah.
No, that will give no time for questions.
We started a little late. It's okay, there will be time for questions.
You think so?
It's very interesting. Please go.
No, I was coming to India, and I should invite myself for a separate talk on that. You know, I don't know whether any of you have noted that as far as India is concerned, as with no other country except China, has India signed so many agreements, had so many summit meetings, developed such a density of dialogue mechanisms, including one where Dr. Anand accompanied me to China. That's been the last one, you know, there's been no repeat of that. Including dialogues at the military to military levels, and obviously, almost surreptitiously, Chinese trade with India has made it one of the largest trading partners, although the balance is very adverse. What does this mean? I don't think leaders just waste their time meeting each other so often. I don't think so much paper is wasted. I'll just quote from a joint statement. I won't quote, but I'll summarize. Signed in May 2013, when the Chinese Premier visited India. The relationship between India and China, and it's a blessing that this formula was devised during the previous rule, of course, coalition government with BJP in the lead and under Atal Bihari Vajpayee. The relationship is seen as one of a strategic and cooperative partnership for peace and prosperity on the basis of the 5 principles: mutual sensitivity. Words like this you don't normally find in statements such as this with countries. And mutual sensitivity for each other's concerns and aspirations. Support each other's friendship with other countries. The relationship transcends bilateral scope and has acquired regional, global, and strategic significance. They are partners for mutual benefit and not rivals or competitors. Must enhance bilateral cooperation on security, maritime security, work together to tackle increasingly non-traditional threats to security. Enhance bilateral engagements at the working level on wide-ranging issues of regional and global significance and subjects, including, and this is important, Afghanistan, West and Central Asia, counter-terrorism, maritime affairs, non-proliferation, and arms control. Implement or persuade others to implement the UN security resolutions on terrorism. Now, it's very easy to dismiss such statements as the abstractions which diplomats like me are damn good at drafting. But that will be a very cynical view, because it is based on our long experience of dealing with China over the years. It is based on our bilateral experience. It is based on common reactions to rapidly changing regional and international situations, where the interests are perceived as being common, and it heightens focus on, I think, current issues facing the region. And I now come bringing all this to a very important phenomenon in India-China relations today. And that is the enormous gap between intergovernmental declarations and public perceptions of this relationship. And the public perceptions reflect deep lack of trust and confidence in China. And how is this to change? This, I think, is a big challenge to those who are interested in India-China relations. And now I can only spout some of my personal views. Of course, I retired from government 20 years ago, so everything is personal. But personal aspiration, shall I say. I would like to see how India and China can together ameliorate the situation in what the Americans call the AFPAC region, or the Afghanistan-Pakistan region. In this region, two transitions are taking place, very big transitions. From tomorrow, the Afghans will start electing a new president, followed, I think, in a few months by a new parliament. And at the same time, in Pakistan, where many problems for Afghanistan originate, there is talk of a sporadic dialogue between the Pakistan government and its nominees and the Taliban, who have several groups based in this very sensitive border regions with Afghanistan. Now, whether the Afghan elections will lead to a government which, of course, is Afghan owned, Afghan respected, and Afghan created, remains to be seen given the divisions within Afghanistan, and whether it will have the strength to overcome the divisive tendencies within Afghanistan, or the capacity and the capability to overcome external interference, which has been one of the biggest banes of Afghanistan from Pakistan. And when talking about Pakistan, and of course, like everybody is an instant China expert, everybody is an instant Pakistan expert also. Talking of Pakistan, it seems to be defying, as it has defied US also, advice on a variety of things, on Jammu and Kashmir problem and not to take it to international fora, on violations of the line of control, acting against bases within Pakistan and pushing infiltrators across. In other words, creating the sort of conditions for a constructive Indo-Pakistan dialogue. These are the desiderata or conditions, criteria which you would like to see. And for all China's professed friendship and its advice, I was in Beijing and Shanghai in September, and when I told them you're good friends, they seem to be defying you. They say we have full sympathy with your concerns, but we cannot interfere in domestic affairs. I mean, this will not do. So, I would like to see a change. I'd like to see a change. And I think one good avenue of change, and it is unexceptionable, and nobody really wanting peace in this very crucial region can object to it, is for India to take an initiative for a broader based dialogue on a regional basis devoted to at least fostering peace from the outside in Afghanistan. And the partners of this dialogue should be India and China, of course, Pakistan, one should not exclude Pakistan, Iran, Central Asian countries, Russia, even USA. And India's biggest interest, of course, is that in any dispensation and in response to the very warm welcome that India has in Afghanistan from the Afghan people, that India, the interest is that India should not be excluded from participating in reconstruction activities in Afghanistan, whatever the future of Afghanistan is. And what India would like to see most emerge in Pakistan, although it might seem to many to be a miracle, is a Pakistan which will emerge, which will stand for modernization, moderation, respect for plurality of faiths, better relations with India, and of course a more normal society. Well, all this is very iffy. We don't know what will happen, but I am making an appeal that there should be a far more proactive approach to this region from India and China. But there are much better prospects in the Bay of Bengal region. Our strategic thinkers may talk about Hambantota, about Gwadar, about the enormous dangers to India from a very ambitious project, which frankly I can't see happening all that soon, but nonetheless our strategic thinkers are absorbed by this. A road link from Gwadar in the Arabian Sea in Pakistan's west coast right up to Xinjiang through Karakoram Pass, etc., along the highway that the Chinese have already built. And of course Hambantota and whatever the Chinese are doing or not doing in Myanmar. I think there's a far more constructive way of looking at it, namely India-China cooperation, such as would open the door for our isolated and alienated people of Northeast India, who can have an opening to Southeast Asia through Myanmar. And Myanmar has never considered itself an exclusive zone of Chinese development. If the Chinese are dominant there, it is because others did not, for ideological reasons, which we for one changed only recently, have given, the outside world gave Myanmar no chance except to depend on China. Then you turn to go on further. The background in which I am saying this is important, and that is that if you look at the map of the world, from what we call West Asia, extending to Central Asia, including South Asia, going on to Southeast and East Asia, Indian and Chinese interests intersect. And it is for us to see whether such an intersection can be beneficial to India, and the hope for this is there, and so we should persist with this. So, talking of Southeast Asia, what India is interested in, and along with that, you have all the littoral states are interested in a collective approach to inclusive security, freedom of navigation, and respect for international law, and resolution of territorial disputes, particularly on the maritime areas, through dialogue. So, India is very well poised. For all our Indo-pessimism, India is extremely well poised. And why do I say this? I say this because particularly from the dawn of the 21st century, India has developed very good relations with all the major powers. USA, European Union, it's a different matter that both of them are in an economic trough. USA, European Union, Russia, Japan, China, with whom we have such resounding statements, and important regional groupings, ASEAN, Shanghai Cooperative Organization, and so on. And therefore, we should nurture these major power relations which we enjoy, seeing to it that no single compartment of any of the relations with any major power affects relations India's relation is another major power. Secondly, obviously we have to strengthen ourselves. Thirdly, we have to have a much more credible and honest political culture. I hope it. And lastly, of course, I think we should be reassured by the fact that certainly one of our defense arms, namely the Indian Navy, is today extremely welcome in all parts of the world. This was not the situation in the last century, particularly when India was seen to be extremely closely allied to the former Soviet Union. So I don't know whether you will consider me a pessimist or an optimist. Such categories are in any case too generalized. But I do feel that we need to nurture this extremely important relationship for India with China. There are problems, but I think if only we got our act together, particularly domestically, such problems can be overcome, particularly as no one outside India, although it's not the same within India, undervalues our great potential. I thank you very much. Can I have a little water, please?
Yes, sure. We'll take questions. Please sit down, sir. I mean, you can, perhaps that's a good place for you to respond to the group. We'll come to you. We have half an hour of questions. I'd request you to keep your questions short, very related to the talk, and one person, one question until the round is over. So can we start with the gentleman there who asked it first? Yeah.
Ranganathan, thanks for a very informative talk. So my question is, if tomorrow China is facing problems at home, just to divert the attention domestic problems, do you think it can again reignite the border issue with China, just as it happened in Depsang? There were talks that because Xi Jinping was struggling to dominate the party, and that's why to sort of resolve those contradictory problems domestically, it sort of ignited the Depsang inclusion. I want your comments on that. I reply to each one? Or?
Yeah, you can do that.
Yeah, I'm afraid I don't agree with this view at all. As far as disturbances or potential conflict along the boundary is concerned, all sorts of mechanisms are there and new mechanisms have been added, like defense cooperation agreement and things like that. So while there will be such, I'm not saying there will not be such instances, I think there's enough political will on both sides to see that such incursions, and mind you, they also complain about our incursions, as long as both sides are agreed that each side has a different perception of the line of control, actual control. You will have such mix-ups, but the fact remains that there has not been a single bloody incident and no lives have been lost. So as long as the boundary question is not solved, I think this will continue. But I think we have the stamina now and the know-how and the density of dialogue that will see that these are solved peacefully. But I don't believe that it's something to divert attention abroad.
1 minute. There's a question you have. Yeah, go ahead.
Sir, you emphasize the economic policy for the China pertaining to SEZ, special economic zone.
Pardon?
SEZ, special economic zone.
Yeah.
They have identified some of the economic zone, and that's how this model of factories and all is working there in China. But at the same time, if you compare with India being one of the first the countries in Asia who have recognized export-oriented unit at first in Gujarat. But still we are struggling with this export, and we still are not able to be capable enough to export that much that we expected. But at the same time, China has become the manufacturing hub. So was it something related, is it something related to with the potential of the Chinese worker, or some policies are there? Is there any comparison in Indian policy and Chinese policy as far as SEZ is concerned?
Well, I'm sorry to say there's absolutely no comparison between India and China in any regard, except of course maybe the nature, perhaps the scale of some of the problems. But your question takes one into an enormous discussion on the intrinsic culture of the Chinese people, and my rather abrupt answer, or not abrupt but certainly short answer to why is it that the Chinese could take advantage of incentives to open up and produce and become more productive, and why is it that similar opportunities in India have not been available. My quick answer to that is that we in India have never been as deprived as the Chinese people have been. We've had a moderate rate of growth, and we perhaps didn't have so many starvation deaths, or we perhaps were not so deprived till as happened during the era of Mao Zedong. So the fact remains that although we might have announced special economic zones, we've had problems with land acquisition, with getting the right type of investments, of trying to develop largely only based on investment from within India. The Chinese, for all their socialistic principles, had absolutely no first wave of China's growth happened. We had our own inhibitions in all these matters, and we depended on islands of excellence like the IITs to produce innovations which could be industrialized and commercialized. IIT Madras has some brilliant examples of that. So we had to wait for such happenings, which were few and far between.
I had a question, maybe answer part of it while answering to Sanket's question, but I wanted your comments on this tussle, Indo-China tussle on Arunachal. Historically, how it has worked, and what is the way forward?
Along with a co-author, I have authored a book precisely on this sort of problem. And I'm sorry to say that the India-China boundary question and the conflict that arose out of that really reflects a history of mutual misperceptions, misunderstandings, and lost opportunities to solve it when they were presented. If I had to elaborate on each of these, it will take me a long time, so I'll stick to Arunachal Pradesh. As far as Arunachal Pradesh is concerned, the external boundary of Arunachal Pradesh was something that the British, the Chinese, and the Tibetans negotiated in 1914. At that time, the main problem was not between the boundary of Tibet and India. The main problem was to demarcate Tibet's external borders on the eastern side with the other provinces of China, what the British used to call inner Tibet and outer Tibet. What faces us as an entity of which the Dalai Lama was the ecclesiastical leader is, in British parlance, outer Tibet. But although there was an agreement, there were protests both from the Tibetans, and the Chinese never signed that agreement. But we said, look, that line was drawn, McMahon line, named after the man who negotiated it, or at least who drew the line, and that should remain India's border in the Arunachal Pradesh area. The Chinese said, we never accepted it even in 1914, how do you expect us to accept it? They said continuously, right even from 1959 when the dispute came out in the open. But, an important but, we do accept that the illegal McMahon line marks the line of control or the line of administrative jurisdiction of India and China. And we are inclined to accept the extension of this line in Burma, as it was called then also. But for this we need to negotiate. Unfortunately, this was not accepted in 1960 when it was offered. And there the situation lies stagnant from that time. How it can be solved? There can be no other solution than the Chinese coming around to realize that what with the record in Tibet, there is no question of people in Arunachal Pradesh welcoming the Chinese. So we have to wait till they reconcile to that. And I don't think there will be any armed action on the part of the Chinese to reinforce this claim. So the stalemate will continue for some time. But what lines of solution lies in that particular sector is very clear.
What was the thought process that went into the NVA's thinking, which made us very early on forfeit our potential card of accepting suzerainty of China over Tibet?
Well, to tell you the truth, concepts such as suzerainty were a British figment of imagination, which sort of described the then state in the 20th century of quite a few situations, not just in Europe, but in relationships with China. The Chinese presence in Tibet was not in the form of what it took after 1950. It was a presence where the Tibetan rulers, before the advent of the Dalai Lamas, used to pay tribute to China. So they said there's Chinese suzerainty over Tibet. No, it is not a viable political reality in in modern times or any time. Now, to believe that therefore we had a leverage on Tibet is again wrong. We had no leverages, particularly in 1949-50 when the Chinese troops entered Tibet. We were in very close communication with the British, the Americans, and all of them. And they said, and obviously we depended more on their archives than ours, that Tibet has never been independent and that China was suzerain. So, when Chinese troops entered Tibet, Nehru asked Field Marshal Cariappa, Field Marshal later, then General Cariappa, do you think we can do anything? To which Cariappa answered, yes, I can spare a battalion. With difficulty. Because he was engaged in Kashmir also. So there was no military option. India would have been utterly isolated in the world if it pleaded for an independent Tibet. It's a different matter that the Westerners, and quite deservedly, venerate His Holiness the Dalai Lama and talk about human rights.
We were the first ones to recognize. We were not isolated. We were the first ones to recognize.
No. I said isolated if you recognize the independence of Tibet.
The West did not.
Certainly not. They can talk. They can preach human rights. But when it comes to taking steps in pursuance of their great fondness for human rights, I am afraid the record is not very good. Or it is misplaced, as in the case of Ukraine now.
We'll take another question.
for India, having seen China's unrestrained growth over the past decade, the cost of society and environment, especially at a time when the dominant political narrative seems to be one of making India strong and prosperous. Do you think India is heading China's way?
I hope not. Really, the essence of your question, as I said earlier, I don't think we should compare ourselves to China in the least in any way. Nor should we, as every visitor to China, Indian visitor to China, come back with a great sense of envy. It is a civilization state. It has its own rhythm. It has made its own progress. It has extremely talented people. And it has enormous unity, except for those who are disenchanted, like the Tibetans and the Xinjiangese, Uyghurs and others. So what I'm trying to say is that it is futile to try and compare. And frankly, there could be lessons in the technological sphere on how they're able to clean up their thermal power plants, but there can be no comparison that can be stretched to the social side, social governance side.
We'll take a question from you, and then we'll come to you.
My question relates more to the future. Very recently, China has lifted the single-child policy.
You're not here probably when I talked about the psychological problems.
Please excuse me for getting a little late on.
No, not to worry. This is an important point. That's why I refer to it.
Yes. So probably there is some other charter that they are writing. So what is your?
I think they now realize that the single-child policy has really caused the most enormous psychological disorientation amongst the public. They are not yet ready to give up the one-child policy. They had diluted it as far as rural areas are concerned, particularly in the minority areas, with the ethnic minority in Xinjiang and Tibet and other places. But it has caused the most enormous distortions, particularly the demographic pattern of the male-female ratio, plus the traditional, like in India, this is a comparison with India, which can be strongly made, and this is a mark of old civilization states, of the tradition of the male child looking after the elderly parents. That pattern is getting distorted, and so on and so forth. So it's very difficult if you're a bachelor in an urban area, particularly a prosperous urban area like Shanghai or Beijing or many urban towns in southern China also. Very difficult if you're a bachelor. I'll put it another way, since I've already said this one. It's a damn good time for unmarried single girls who can demand the most enormous things if they are to get married. A house, the agreement not to live with one's in-laws, a car, etc. It's very good for single ladies.
They also reappropriated their expenditure of GDP on science and technology.
Oh yeah, they've increased it.
Yes.
And they keep increasing every year. And I wish I knew more about this area. In fact, in future visits, I'd like to hear more about your assessment here of the S&T developments in China. I wish I knew more about it, but there's no doubt that they are paying it the most enormous attention. Yeah, in terms of percentage of investments in such areas. Yes.
We'll take a question from Professor Radhan.
Very insightful lecture, and I like to be very sharp observations.
Thank you.
But a small problem. I find this too state-centered and diplomacy-oriented. It starts from the very placement of the words problem and contradiction in the title. Now, one would expect a prosperous China faces contradictions at home and problems abroad. Because as a state, it could resolve problems amongst other countries or the relationship with other countries, whereas within the nation it is basically an economy. Any social scientist will read that as state capitalism, and contradiction starts there. Socialism as part of the rhetoric now, and then the operating economy as state capitalism. And one would like to know more about the contradictions embedded in that kind of an economy.
You are most welcome to invert my title, but I stick to it. I stick to it because there are these what I call problems, and I identified them at some length, and one could go on about the problems. Contradictions because what they say about what they'd like their foreign policy to be and their actions contradict each other. It's in that sense that I'm using it. As far as your other remark on isn't there a contradiction with socialism and the sort of capitalist, you didn't use the word capitalism, and the sort of development path they've chosen. Yes, the world outside has watched with absolute fascination but how a mono-party state with its professed allegiance to Marxism, Leninism, and even Mao is not disavowed in China by any means, and so on, can progress this way. But they are a very pragmatic people, and they have not been bound by the ideological constraints even of the communist parties of India, even today, in spite of a changed world. And the use of the word contradictions again is something that the Chinese are very fond of using, and in their general cosmology, cosmogony, they feel that one should live with contradictions and till a time is appropriate when these are solved. So they see no contradiction between utterances and actions, which is a very difficult thing for neighbors to reconcile if you're a neighbor of China.
Your excellent analysis and many positive suggestions that you gave in the end are wonderful. At the end of the talk, you made one very important point. I want to say that. You said, in the process of dialogue between India and China in the future, we in India need to develop a better political culture. What can that be in the present situation?
Good one. Well, our electoral politics in India is so topsy-turvy that it's difficult even to be sensible about it. But having said that, I would say that over the last at least 2 decades, there's been an absolute deterioration of political culture in India. And frankly, one cannot see any immediate signs of this improving regardless of whoever wins the elections or forms a central government. And this itself, it's a socio-anthropological, cultural, economic, it has a mix of all this. And how we are going to develop a better class of political rulers will continue to remain a challenge for India for a long time to come, and we have to reconcile to that. Meanwhile, we'll have to reconcile also to living beneath our potential, which is what people like me who have in the past, and fortunately no longer in the present, I hope not in the future also, have to represent our country. Because this is one question to which foreigners keep repeating. Why is it that you can't do this? Why is it that your economy can't? Why is it that you still have this caste system? Why is it that you have bright burning. How do you answer these questions? In other words, the outside world has a much greater, I would put it as strong as vested interest that we develop as a stable, prosperous conglomerate with such a large population, living in peace with our neighbors. Nothing irritates the outside world more today than to hear of another India-Pakistan conflict. They are bored with it.
We'll take a question then, and then we'll come.
I refer to this perception that China wants to have a bipolar world where
What's a bipolar world?
where European nations and USA, perhaps even Russia will be on one side and China could be on the other side. Whereas our present relations are so strong with Europe and since you refer that we must develop relations equally with all this, don't you see a difficulty in managing both these relations with China on one hand and with the strong relations we already have with Europe and USA?
I see no difficulty whatsoever. Going back to some of the phrases that I included from the thing, the importance of India-China relations is something that leaders of both sides have recognized amply. And there's no going back on that. It took a long time to develop, right from 1988 when I happened to be ambassador in China and when Rajiv Gandhi visited, the first visit in 34 years from an Indian Prime Minister, etc., etc. From then, incrementally, there are strong vested interests developed in China for a stable relationship with India, and that's my answer to your question also about the boundary. But how the quality of this relationship can be seen to actually exist in fact needs to be tested from difficult regional situations which affect both of us. And I see no sign of that yet. And I hope it happens. In fact, I am one of those who attaches far more importance to these regional situations, even more importance than solution of the boundary question.
Sir, do you think there will be a reduction in the interference of the Chinese government in areas like Xinjiang and Tibet under Xi Jinping's rule?
Under?
Xi Jinping.
Do I see anything improvement? No, I can't, unfortunately. You see, recently there was this incident in Kunming where 27 or 29 people were killed, allegedly by Uyghurs from Xinjiang. And the reply was that we should build an iron and brass wall to maintain ethnic unity. This was the reply official. What I'm trying to say is the Chinese, particularly the majority Han race, is insensitive to the religious, cultural and other identities of these people, whether it's practice of Islam or the Lamaistic Buddhism in China. They feel that involvement in faith such as affects even the daily living habits of people excludes loyalty to the one-party state. So they just cannot reconcile to that. Now I come to what my friend talked about, this is a contradiction that exists within China, and I don't see under Xi Jinping any early change.
What does the constitution say?
Consequences is disaffection, alienation will continue. At the same time, very strong-arm methods to put down opposition. I don't see this changing unless a totally new leader or a different, or the present leadership adopts a different policy.
Okay, so does the constitution see all the religions equally?
Yes.
We'll take a question there.
My question is, why do we need to solve the border issue with China? Can't we just leave it as a stalemate and continue on other things?
I feel very sympathetic to this point of view, and that's exactly what's happening in our bilateral relations. And I attach more importance to other problems.
But by looking at other problems, the trade imbalance that we have with China
Oh, very different. So,
there's a question there.
more investment from China.
That is what it will work against us in future when we have conflict with China and on real battleground. On your question.
So, this is with regard to that recent Henderson-Brooks report. Notwithstanding the sympathetic nature of that report towards the Chinese, I do hear from various people that China, despite that 1962 war, they didn't occupy much of Indian territory. So, what is your take on that?
Well, first of all, the Henderson-Brooks report was not sympathetic to China as much as much needed critical appraisal of what happened in India and Indian leadership, and particularly military leadership, and so on and so forth. So the Henderson-Brooks report has to be seen as a very objective report on what went wrong. The other part of your question was, could you repeat that, your last part?
It said that China, despite
this occupation. Well, what is true is that as a result of 1962 conflict, the Chinese occupied a little more territory in the Ladakh region. I think some 2,000 etc. Some 2,000 square 2,000 square. Sorry. Yeah, in the Aksai Chin, in square miles. Yeah, in areas abutting Aksai Chin. So, these are all the matters that need to be negotiated when it comes down to a give and take of territory, and without give and take, there can be no solution.
So, do you mean to say that they did not occupy at any other point, including?
No, as you recall, or you may not recall, they withdrew from all the areas that they'd occupied in Arunachal Pradesh, what we now call Arunachal. Those years we used to call it Northeast Frontier Agency. They withdrew from all that area. Yeah. Here's a China expert, and I dread what will come.
So there's the impression that the Xi Jinping China regime is probably the most repressive since the 1970s, since the late 1970s. Do you agree with that?
I wouldn't agree with that. I don't think they're any more or less repressive. Oh, so since 70s you said?
Since the 1970s. The dissidents are getting it in a big way now.
Likely that they are a little more repressive, in the sense that Xi Jinping certainly sees himself in the mold of the sort of leader that China should have. And any suggestion that the party dominance is questioned will result in very strong reactions. But I'd be careful before entering into any argument about comparing it to the past. If you recall, and more than anybody else in this room, even more than me, you know this better. This gentleman is a great China expert. In 1978 and onwards, Deng Xiaoping's reforms, one of the four cardinal principles ruled by the Communist Party of China. Reform, opening up, and all the rest of it are there. So this fundamental principle will not be deviated from. You might call it, for a variety of reasons, including an intrinsic feeling of insecurity. But this takes us into the realm of political psychiatry. You're right, the Chinese, you didn't say so, I'm saying so. The Chinese do feel insecure because they feel that
the stronger appeal of the sort of things that USA is capable of, soft power, whatever it is a threat to themselves. They've always seen it in that light. And you know what Deng Xiaoping said. He said, in the process of reforms, when we open our windows, some flies and mosquitoes will get in. But don't bother about them. They are a very mnemonic people. They go by proverbs, and that is policy. And that is what the language does to them also.
We have we are trying
You
to
think
do
so?
quick fire questions.
You think so? My driver, I promised. I said I'll be there by 5:15. Anyway.
One minute. Is there anyone else? Because these two gentlemen have already asked questions. If there is no one else, we'll go to them. Yeah.
What China is doing to curb their social problems. Like recently, I was reading one article in some news agency that they have started some matrimonial platform for leftover women and leftover males.
Very important.
What is that?
No, this just shows the acute nature of the problems that discuss. In fact, matrimonial agencies, to introduce people, have proliferated in China precisely because of social problems.
Absolutely last questions. You take one and you take one. Quick fire.
Thank you. Sir.
You're allowing second rounds.
No one else raised their hands. So.
Sir, we briefly dealt with the problem Xinjiang related issues. Sir, much of the terrorist related, or I should say conflict in Xinjiang emanates because there is a lot of state support from Pakistan.
Yes, not state support, but anyway.
Yeah. So the East Turkestan Islamic movement has a lot of bases within Afghanistan and in Pakistan. So how has China's approach been towards Pakistan in sort of controlling or curbing the Xinjiang issue vis-a-vis Pakistan?
They do not mince any words in private conversations that Pakistan is a big danger to themselves. But having said this, I think they have their own way of twisting their arm to see that at least the Pakistan base is kept under very close monitor by the Pakistani agencies. But as far as influences from other areas are concerned, in fact, the headquarters of this East Turkestan movement is actually in Turkey. I don't think the Chinese have much capacity to try and alter that.
Absolutely the last question.
Actually, East Turkestan Republic existed for over 5 years. But anyway, my question is...
Did exist, correct.
From 1953, 55 or something.
Absolutely, no, earlier.
It was the Republic, Islam. Anyway, my question is separate. They talk about Kashmir as a disputed territory.
That's right.
And they say that they will not deal with, they keep it a dispute territory, but they have accepted from Pakistan the ceding of the Shakskan Valley. Have we from the MEA side ever taken it up, saying that your stated policy is don't touch disputed territory, but you have accepted ceding of Shakskan? And have you taken up this dichotomy and said that you say something and you do something else?
It has been taken up repeatedly.
What is their answer?
Their answer is that we want India and Pakistan to solve their problems bilaterally and including Jammu and Kashmir. As far as Shakskan is concerned, they say that it has been done on the basis of a sovereign government of Pakistan ceding territory over which they have control.
Control, not sovereignty.
They then use the word control. You can go back to correspondence between the governments of India and China. In fact, the India-China thing has been an open document. People keep on complaining, this thing, except for Henderson Book's report. 12 white papers have brought out all correspondence between India and China, including this problem, when it came up in 1963. I was then a very junior officer in the Ministry of External Affairs. Therefore, I know about it. I remember it. Thank you very much. And
Thank you very much. It's been a wonderful evening with you.
Thank you, Doctor.
And we, on behalf of the Center for Contemporary Studies and the Indian Institute of Science, would like to give you a small gift in appreciation. And I'll not tell you what it is. It is a thank you.
It's heavy, whatever it is.
It is. I would, the Center for Contemporary Studies has been growing in strength, and we invite all those who have come here for the first time to give their email addresses and their mobile numbers so that we can contact them when other interesting speakers, including Mr. Ranganathan, if he hopefully accepts our invitation and comes again, to be intimated about the event. One interesting thing is, I'd like to share with you, this is the 10th year of the Center for Contemporary Studies, and we have been having a lot of visitors who have been coming here very consistently. And one of them happens to be Mr. Manmohan Reddy, a good friend of mine, as well as a good friend of Mr. Ranganathan. And I'd like to leave the last word to him. Thank you very much.
I thought you'd given the last word.
No, there's still a last word to a last word.
I'd like to thank Mr. Ranganathan for a very distinguished talk. He doesn't like to call himself an authority on China, and as he said, it's like calling ourselves authorities on India when we're not. But it's obvious that his talk today was the result of an incisive mind looking at China for nearly half a century. One can disagree with some of the things that he said. One can take exception to some of the comments that were made here. But I'd like to add a very personal point, and that is that I was glad today that, at least in this audience, we don't seem to be obsessed with 1962. I'm not saying that we need to forget about it, but we certainly need to stop being obsessed by it if we need to move ahead and be good friends not only with China, but the rest of our neighbors as well. Thank you, Mr. Ranganathan.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So we hope to have you again.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And you're going to be followed by a few